this year, and we work to protect, restore, and care for the Columbia River. And so our geographic scope is the whole Columbia River Basin, but we primarily work from the Canadian border, in Washington, down to the Pacific Ocean, on many of the tributaries as well. And we have about 12,000 members, are people who support this work all up and down the river. And we have offices in Hood River, where I'm based, and in Portland. And we have a staff of 15 people. We have a lot of volunteers, but 15 paid staffers, and that includes environmental attorneys like myself. It includes community organizers, communications experts, staff scientists, and our budget, sometimes people ask this, I thought I'd throw this out there, is just over $2 million for this year. So we've grown from when I started. We had 3 employees to 15, and our work has become, I think the Columbia River deserves an organization that is solely dedicated to the Columbia. And in the Tri-Cities area where you are, the really amazing part of the basin, the Columbia at the confluence of the Snake River, and we see one of our goals is to try to protect and restore salmon. That's obviously a big part of the Columbia. Reduce toxic pollution and engage people into getting involved. Our organization actually started as a predecessor group in 1989, a group called Columbia River United that formed around Hanford issues and trying to advocate for Hanford cleanup. So I'll talk a little bit about Hanford because it's obviously important. Let's see, what else on an overview? I'll leave it there. And just as a couple examples of the type of work we do, we try to encourage stewardship in local communities. This is an example of a tree planting we did. We do education in schools. If people don't understand and get their hands dirty and love the place that they're love the place that they live, they're not going to protect it. So we think that that stewardship is a really important part of this work. We do some water quality sampling, where our primary thing right now is we're testing for E. coli at popular swimming and fishing and recreation areas. E. coli is a fecal bacteria that can make people sick. So we have volunteers and interns and our staff collect E. coli collect water samples and test them for E. coli. We work a lot on toxic pollution as well, trying to push for better policies to reduce toxic pollution to, keep people safe when they're swimming and fishing in the rivers. And then I mentioned Hanford. Hanford is one of many, contaminated sites that Columbia Riverkeeper is engaged in. Some of these are smaller sites. Hanford is obviously a big one. We've worked on old aluminum mills and paper mills and things that are no longer in operation, that have left contamination, and we try to push for fast and thorough cleanup of those. I wanted to show this photo of Hanford, and you're all Hanford is obviously a huge part of the economy and history of the Tri-Cities, and so much of the images we see are of the tank farms and the reactors. And as you all know, probably more than anyone, it is a beautiful, amazing area, the Hanford Reach of the Columbia. It's one of the last 50 miles of free-flowing river. It's the best spawning area on the main stem. This is a beautiful photo of the White Bluffs. And I get up there about once a year and get to float that stretch, and we bring people up, and it's from where I live further downriver, where there's railroads on both sides, and you're in the reservoirs of the dams and the highways, to get to see the Columbia this beautiful stretch of the Hanford Reach is really amazing. Um, that's not to say that the cleanup isn't important, and it is. And we're definitely advocating to the federal government to do a thorough cleanup of Hanford. It's complicated. I think we probably all share the common goal of, um, we need as a nation to invest in cleanup at Hanford. We need to finish the job, do a good job. And one of my fears is that, Congress pulls some of the funding for Hanford. And I think that's not only a problem for the environment, but, for jobs in the region as well. So we're going to continue to advocate for Hanford cleanup as a really primary piece of what Columbia Riverkeeper does. Um, okay, so there was two topics I was going to do a little deeper dive on. One is the topic of fossil fuel export and infrastructure that we've been working on a lot, and then the other is the hot water in the Snake River dams and the Columbia River, the hot water issue first. So I'm going to start with this. And these are big issues. These are big, complex issues. I'm not going to be able to do them justice, but one thing that we've seen over the last decade is on the lower Columbia, and this affects y'all as well in the Tri-Cities due to the transport of trains, but we've seen shipping terminals proposed to be built on the lower Columbia in Longview, Washington, in Vancouver, and in Portland, and near Astoria, that would take coal, oil, or fracked gas and propose to export it to Asia. And so the North America has some of the largest reserves in the world of coal in the Powder River Basin, which is shown by those red spots. The Alberta tar sands, the Bakken Formation of crude, and there's proposals to export some of this to Asia. This is an image from some of our colleagues at the Sightline Institute. And so what does this look like for us here? There's many communities down in the estuary of the lower Columbia that have been challenging the construction of these shipping terminals. And what we see here in the gorge where I live and what you see in the Tri-Cities where you live are the transport that would be taking these trains of oil from North Dakota and Wyoming and elsewhere and trying to reach the ocean. So you probably saw an uptick of these about 7 or 8 years ago. It has fluctuated, but we're seeing, it fluctuates with the market, but overall we've seen a general uptrend of oil trains. And that has a lot of concerns for us as an environmental organization. I mean, one is the risk of spills into the Columbia River, not only from the trains, but the risk of the tankers. There'd be deep draft vessels of oil leaving the Columbia River for the first time ever. The thought of an Exxon Valdez type spill on the Columbia in the estuary where the salmon nursery would be absolutely devastating. We have concerns about the safety. I was able to, several years ago, some of you may recall, there was an explosion in the little town of Mosier, which is the town right next door to where I live, and we were able to go see that, where an oil train derailed and exploded. Fortunately, no one was killed there, but there's definitely concerns of oil trains derailing, spilling, exploding. And then there's the terminals themselves, which would be big new industrial sites in the estuary and areas that are trying to be restored right now for salmon habitat. And then there's, of course, the climate aspect of it as well. We are trying to move towards clean energy, and if we build this infrastructure, we're going to lock in additional years of fossil fuel consumption. So we have oil trains. This is a facility in South Africa, but it's slightly bigger than what was proposed in Longview, Washington. But this is what a coal export terminal would look like. That has we're currently in litigation over the state of Washington has denied this facility in Longview, Washington, but the coal company is challenging that. You probably also saw an uptick in coal trains coming through the Tri-Cities for a while there too. If these were built, it would dramatically, this facility in Longview, for example, would add 8 new coal trains every single day. And then we're also seeing new fracked gas, which is also known as natural gas. It's methane, and they're making petrochemicals out of it. The United States has a lot of gas, which is, we call it fracked gas because it's the drilling process uses hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And the U.S. is kind of awash with that. We've done so much fracking, so much production that they're trying to ship this out as liquefied natural gas or as petrochemicals. And many of the communities we work with have a lot of concerns about building new refineries. There's a big one proposed in Columbia, Washington, and as well as one near Clatskanie, Oregon. This you wouldn't see as much of the transportation impacts in the Tri-Cities because it's being shipped on pipelines. So, and, you know, I should say there are proponents of these projects, obviously, you know, the corporations, there's people, there's some the building trade unions that are supporting these, there's people in communities supporting these, there's also a lot of opposition, and we're part of that. We're trying to fight against new fossil fuel infrastructure. So this is a map of the lower Columbia that we have. These are the proposals over the last decade, and the red X's signify those that have been defeated. A lot of it has been, frankly, local communities rising up and saying they don't think this is appropriate in their community. We've seen local new county commissions get elected, and for example, Clatsop County voted 5-0 in favor of one of these projects. After the next several cycles of elections, they then voted 5-0 against it from their new county commissioners, who ran opposed to liquefied natural gas. So some of these have been electoral, some have been state government denials, some have been local government denial. Some of the companies have pulled out, but there are some still very active issues that Columbia Riverkeeper and our partners are working on. Okay, that was a lot on fossil fuels pretty quickly. I was going to move on and talk about some of the hot water issues, but why don't I pause there? Does anybody have any comments or questions about any of that?
Brett, this is Mike Paola here. A question on the issue with the fossil fuel exports. Are those all going to, when you say to Asia, is that like China and Japan, which you had highlighted, or I thought some of those were going to third world countries as well? And the reason I ask is because where's the balance between the need for electricity and the environment in some of these third world, very poor countries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it varies with the different facilities. Sometimes, you know, it's frankly a market issue a lot of the time of where it's going. I'll give you an example. Northwest Innovation Works, the petrochemical they would be exporting is called methanol. They said they have contracts with factories in China that would make plastics out of that. The LNG typically goes to where the market is best for it, where they can make the most money. Some of this stuff would be used as fuels to burn in vehicles and factories. Some of it could be used, for electricity. But yeah, I think most of the proposals would be going to Asia, whether that's Japan, Korea. As far as the question on electricity for different regions, a lot of a lot of developing countries are moving right past fossil fuels and moving to renewable energy, which is cleaner and rapidly becoming cheaper. And so we think that that's where we need to go. There's a lot of investment in developing countries, and even places like China is the world's leader in renewable energy. And so if they're able to skip over dirty fossil fuels and move right to renewables with a lot of investment from other places, we think that that's the best way to go.
Okay, thanks.
So we get about 40% of our funding from individual members. We have 12,000 members. Some give $20, some give thousands, and so that's a really big, important part of our revenue. We also, the major part of it, in addition to that, is from foundations, primarily. You know, private foundations that support environmental and social justice work. By taking on, we challenge places like the oil company Tesoro was proposing to build the oil terminal in Vancouver, Washington, and we were challenging that. And that's one example of, we don't get support from obviously a lot of big corporations like Tesoro, and so we rely on individuals up and down the river, and on foundations. As you know, there's often community foundations, or there's some larger foundations, and a lot of that comes from individuals too, who have built wealth and put them in foundations. And so those are our two primary sources of funding. We also get some attorney fee recovery there's certain federal statutes that if you prevail in litigation, you get your fees back that you've put into it. Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't I'll move on to just some of the hot water issues here, and again, I'm going to keep this fairly high level and be happy to, dive into any deeper, but, setting aside, so there is an effort there has been an effort, as you know, to breach Snake River dams in order to allow salmon to better reach upper river habitat. We support that. We think that that is the right thing to do right now. And I can talk more about that. But even setting that aside for a moment, whether that's that has its own complicated factors, obviously, with barge traffic and agriculture. But circling back to one of the problems that hasn't got probably as much attention as it's deserved for all of us who love salmon in the Northwest is the river temperature. And so the Columbia and Snake Rivers and many of the tributaries are too hot right now. So salmon, as you know, are a cold water species. They need, and 68 degrees is the maximum limit that scientists have established and codified into the law and state water quality standards as the safe level for salmon for migration. For spawning, they need cooler water than that, but the warmest the river should get is 68 degrees. And this is a photo of a sockeye salmon from 2015 when we had a massive die-off. And when the river was too hot. Right now, the Columbia River, much of the length of it regularly exceeds 68 degrees for several months, for about 2 months summer. And it's a problem. And with climate change on top of that, the river is continuing to get warmer and warmer. And so, if we don't do something about the hot water issue, it's likely going to get worse. And I will say this is an extremely complicated issue. There are no easy solutions. I don't pretend to know this easy solutions. Um, I'm simply right now. I can talk about some solutions in a minute, but I'm just trying to identify this as a problem. Um, this is a um, I'll try to wrap up here in 5 minutes or so. This is a chart from federal government data from the mid 1940s. If you can't see the detail of this, from 1945, which is on the x-axis going up to 2020 with average August water temperature at Bonneville. You could draw a similar chart at any one of the dams. They wouldn't go as far back because Bonneville is one of the earliest ones, and there's a red trend line showing the increase in the temperature in August at Bonneville. This is a problem as it continues to move on. As you'll see, it's exceeding the safe level. In 2015, this is a quote from EPA, an estimated 250 adult sockeye died, primarily because of encountering warm water exceeding 20 degrees, which is the same as 68 degrees. This is a quote from another federal agency, the Fish Passage Center. Long recognized and largely unaddressed problem of high water temperature. So what we saw, on sockeye and many salmon, they do the pit tags. They tag the fish so they can track some of them. And in 2015 was a very hot, dry year, a low water year, and sockeye run in June. And so, and they spawn in lakes. They go all the way to the lakes in Idaho, and when they could reach them, British Columbia and up in the Okanagan. The fish got through Bonneville, got through the Dells, got through John Day, and reached all the way up to McNary. They were tracking some fish, and they literally turned around. Some of the fish would turned around that they'd been tracking, swam back down through the dams, and would hole up in the tributaries, some of the cold water tributaries, swimming around in circles, waiting to die. And we lost, about half of that run. We are concerned that that's sort of a canary in the coal mine of, as the water continues to warm up, that's what's going to happen. So the dams on the main stem and on the Snake would fit into this category too. These are one of the river dams. This is McNary by Umatilla. Upstream of they're shallow dams. They warm up. People talk about planting trees to cool down the water. You recognize that that's probably not a solution in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon. And the reservoirs heat up, and they slow down the water. So here's a map showing Pasco, showing Portland, and kind of the stair-step effect of all of these dams, including the Snake. This is some modeling that we hired someone to do, looking at the 2015, this year when it was so hot. So the chart on the left is the 4 lower Snake River dams, the actual measured temperature by putting a thermometer in the water from the federal government that they do at the dams. Maybe not a thermometer, their temperature sensors equipment. And on the right is a computer model developed by EPA of what would happen if those dams weren't there. And so you probably heard Kurt Miller talk about the rivers are going to be hot anyways, or with or without the dams. And yes, so without the dams, this in 2015, it would have exceeded the safe level of 68 degrees, but it would have done it for a couple of weeks. We see spikes in hot weather and the river will adjust back down. But with the dams in place, we saw it from June through September where it's exceeding the safe level at a place like Ice Harbor. And so EPA recently, and I know Mr. Miller talked about this, recently came out with a document called the TMDL, which was a plan to try to address the temperature issues. The state of Washington recently weighed in and said, we are going to exert our authority to make sure the rivers meet the safe level. And so I think it's beyond debate that there is a problem. The solutions are where it gets a little more tricky. Okay, so I'll just quickly move through some of this. So there's some potential solutions. Lowering the water level in the reservoirs. There's less surface area to absorb solar radiation. Increasing the flow, which will have less resident time for the water. It may heat up less in the reservoirs. The fish ladders themselves are hotter than the ambient water, and so trying to do some things to reduce that. And potentially removing dams is the most dramatic, and for the Snake River, the probably likely only way to reduce the temperature in order to protect salmon. So I'll end with two quick things here. In the gorge, and I look forward to hearing your comments or questions. There's recently, this was 7 or 8 years ago, on a tributary called the White Salmon River, and obviously this didn't have transportation issues, but there was a dam called the Condit Dam, and after many years, the utility tore it down, and there was a lot of talk about, well, it's going to decide decade to recolonize. And the very next year, someone captured this photo of one of the salmon jumping up the waterfall, and it's a example of salmon may be on the brink right now, but they are resilient, and they have recolonized the rivers where we've allowed them to return to habitat. And I'm very hopeful that we as humans can restore some of that habitat and allow them to reach places, and then they'll do the rest. And I'll wrap up, this is my last slide, by saying, we are an advocacy group. We try to take strong stances and fight for clean water. Not everyone's going to agree with us. I'm proud of the work we do in many communities, and working together. I think we have a lot more common goals throughout this region than what really divides us. And I hope we can, as an organization, continue working with many communities up and down the Columbia.
Thank you, Brett.
So,
we have a lot of time, about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and comments. So please go ahead, everybody.
yeah. Yeah, EPA just released a big study on that last month, and they actually went and looked at each dam individually and gave it what's called a load allocation, or how much that dam is contributing to the temperature problem. And so they've done that dam by dam, and cumulatively it's a lot. It's several degrees that the dams are causing. Yes, our climate is getting warmer, the ocean's getting warmer, the air is getting warmer, and that's definitely part of it. But the dams